This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, now you can hear me. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this seminar part of our Retrace and Proceeds projects series of seminars that have been going for the past year. We are close to 1 year of the pandemic now.
Let's try again if now it works.
Okay.
This conference will now be recorded.
We were introducing you, so just a second, we can start. Aki, it's over to you for the introduction.
So today we have the honor to welcome a prominent economist, Professor Lorenzo Esposito, Senior Inspector at the Central Bank of Italy and faculty member at the Catholic University of Milan. Being an expert on banking and finance, Professor Esposito currently focuses his research interests on the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on world economy, especially in the context of global sourcing and the numerous supply chain disruption and shortages that have occurred since the beginning of this pandemic. Today's seminar will focus on how global value chains are shaped in this post-COVID era, emphasizing on contagion, reshoring, and trade wars. So if everything is okay from a technical point of view, Professor, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good evening. Of course, I will speak only on personal capacity. So, of course, I'm not spelling the name of the Bank of Italy today. And I will present this work that is co-authored with Professor Mastro Matteo, that also works at the Cattolica University in Milan. So, what is our idea? Our idea is to understand, to deepen what is happening after more or less a year from the start of the pandemic to the global value chains on the economic and also on the political side. So the pandemic, of course, in a sense, changed everything. As the IMF said in April, this crisis is like no other. So for many aspects, this crisis has no cannot be compared to anything else. But we must also underline that the pandemic hits on the points that were already weak before the crisis started. For instance, the deflation, especially in the commodity prices, started even before the pandemic. And this is also true, for instance, for the weaknesses in many sectors. So the pandemic, in a sense, acted magnifying some trend that was already there before the pandemic. And this is true, of course, for the globalization as a whole. Already after the financial crisis of 2008, we had seen some deglobalization trend, but not a complete reversal. We only had a stop in the growth of the importance of globalized processes. We have also seen that with the 2008 financial crisis, it became obvious that the growth of the financial markets, the growth of the biggest banks in the world before the crisis, also entailed a strong increase in the systemic risk. In the risk that if something goes wrong in some markets, it goes wrong everywhere. And this is also true for global value chains, because global value chains increases the synchronization of prices, output, and so on. And for all these reasons, even before the Trump administration, we that trade policies in many countries turned against globalization. And in effect, the only country that really defended the free trade on a world scale was China for obvious reasons. Of course, the excuse of the systemic risk was also used to favor anti-free trade policies in many countries. Of course, we had seen that there were already many analyses that underline the fact that the systemic dimension of the global value chains and of the financial markets was there. So many commentators highlighted the fact that the global value chains increased the problem of the systemic risk. The fact that if you have a problem in a country, in a sector, in a firm, you have more spillovers in other parts of the world economy. The problem
Lorenzo,
was, yes.
I'm sorry, may I interrupt just a moment, because I believe that your presentation is not updating.
The slides are not changing.
No, indeed.
Okay.
Not yet, yeah.
Now you can see the number. You can see the slides with the globalization.
Perfect. Yes.
Sure.
Much appreciated. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So sorry. So you didn't see the slides. This slide.
I'm afraid no. After the first one, we missed it.
So,
they will be saved later now. Thank you. If you can start over so we can have the presentation. I mean, not start over, but showing the slides. Much appreciated. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. This was the first slide that I was commenting, and as you can see, the graph shows that the deflation in many commodity prices was already there before the pandemic. So what I was saying, that this crisis is like no other, but the waypoints were already there, is clearly from this graph. As I was talking about different aspects of the deglobalization after the crisis of 2008, and as I said, many perceived this problem. Many perceived that the systemic dimension of the global value chains was there.
I'm afraid we lost you again.
Oops. Yeah, I think there is some connection problem at Lorenzo's end. I don't know. We can let's see if he's able to restart, to reconnect. This is the problem when you arrange this sort of live events.
Problem with the problem of systemic risk in the financial sector. On the contrary, we did not have alternatives to the global value chain. This is a graph that shows what I was talking about. That is, even after 2008, the importance of the FDI, of the role of the global value chains, was not reversed, even if there was a slowdown. For instance, in this graph, we can see that after the crisis of 2008, the importance of the global value chains, and of course is not easy to measure, but anyway, generally speaking, the importance of the global value chains as a percentage of the world trade slowed down a bit. Not so much, but it was lower than the peak before the crisis. And another important point is that this growth of the systemic risk both in the financial market and in the normal market, so to speak, with the global value chains, also was connected to a growth in inequality, a growth in the market shares of the biggest firms in many sectors, and so on and so forth. So this was the situation at the start of the pandemic. What can we say of the measures that have been taken against the pandemic? First of all, they were impressive in terms of speed and dimension. If we compare the two crises, 2008 and the pandemic, we can see that the intervention this time were a lot more rapid and a lot bigger. There was no discussion about if intervening, but only how to intervene. And we can see the consequence of these impressive measures in terms of course, an increase in public debt. For instance, in the case of the US, the overall debt, federal debt, will increase more or less about 5 trillion in 2020, and the Federal Reserve System assets will increase more or less by 3.5 trillion, so a lot, of course. And overall, the IMF measures the aggregate interventions, fiscal interventions, in around $14 trillion. So a very, very big number. And you can see that the discussion that is going on now in the US is about a new intervention that is more or less $2 trillion more dollar more cash in the economy. So the intervention is very, very big. Of course, these measures were meant to stop the fallout of the economy at the beginning of the pandemic, but now the discussion is not only on the emergency side, so to speak, but on a more structured intervention in the economy. So public policies will be very important to reshape also the industrial landscape. And even in this field, this is not something that was completely unheard before the crisis, but we will see a big increase in the public intervention.
Lorenzo, I think we lost you for a moment. Can you hear us? That's a pity, but unfortunately it's not within our control. Lorenzo, can you hear us? Sorry, Lorenzo. Yes, yeah, we lost you for a bit.
Okay, I was commenting.
We lost you where you were talking about the resurgence of state-owned enterprises. Yes. I think that was the moment.
I'm moving towards the Wi-Fi, so I hope that the connection will be better. Okay, so we will see a resurgence, a bigger role for the state-owned enterprises. But as I told, this is not something that is completely unheard also before the pandemic. In this slide, I try to sum up the different motivations for global value chains. it is important to point out that there are different reasons, different motivations for the global value chains, because now that we are not after the pandemic, but we are in the second stage, so to speak, of the pandemic, we will see different ways in which the sectors are affected by the pandemic because of these different motivations. For instance, we have an issue, of course, of cost advantages, but we have also an issue of friendly politics. So different policies have been used to attract investments and attract factories, industrial sectors, industrial investment, and so on. There's also an issue of technologies, because of course the supply chain that now is completely connected to digital technologies cannot function without these enabling technologies. So more investment in this field will also affect global value chains. Another important point is that, of course, value chains are not only meant to create a production abroad, but also to create a market abroad. So, for instance, China is no longer so competitive in terms of simple wages vis-a-vis other Asian countries, but of course, it's a very huge market. So it's a very interesting market for many products. So you can go in a market, so to speak, because wages are very low, but you can stay there because wages are increasing, and so the market is increasing too. And the last point, important point, is the issue of diversification. We can use an analogy with the financial markets. We know that, of course, diversification is good because diversification allows an investor to decrease the counterparty risk. The problem is that the systemic risk increases the correlation among asset classes. So the diversification is difficult, more and more difficult in a globalized world. We have seen this many times in the financial sector. Global value chains has a similar outcome in the industrial sectors. So overall, the issue is that we cannot detect common trends because the motivations can be very different in the different sectors. So even now, these different motivations can hit the sectors in the pandemic differently. We have tried to synthesize what we consider the main post-pandemic or pandemic influencing aspects. First of all, of course, there is an issue of health and security issues. So the fact that most of the drugs that are used in the advanced economies come from China and from India is now considered an issue, a problem, because when the pandemic starts, the fact that in Europe no masks or other devices were available was, of course, a concern. A second point, as I said, is the technological issue. The fact that you can have an acceleration in the process of digitalization of the economy, because, of course, this is the only way to save some sector, smart working, e-commerce, and so on and so forth. In the global value chain literature, there is also some works that show that you can have such a great technology innovation that allows for a reshoring trend, because it becomes convenient again to produce something in your country because the technology is a lot better than before. This may be true in some sector, but overall, I don't think that the technology will increase the productivity so much that this kind of reshoring will be a general trend, but this is the point. In other sectors, of course, we have different issues because the sectors can have very different global value chains. And the general point is that the more fragmented, the longer is the global value chains, the more it can be hit by problems in one part of the chain, because this global value chains is connected as a snake, as in a very famous paper is called, and not as a web. So you do not have alternatives. You have different parts of the chain all connected one another. So if one part is blocked, the whole chain is blocked. Then, of course, we have financial issues. That is how you fund your global value chain, how you fund your different supply chain. And as I said, of course, this will be an issue of state intervention. The state will be very present in the field of reshaping the supply chains. Then we have a point of consumers issue. I'm not telling that the consumers will only consume national brands again, also because in many fields you do not have national brands. For instance, we do not have smartphones that are made in Europe, or PCs that are made in Europe, so you do not can consume a made in Italy smartphone. But in other fields where we do have national brands, we can see, I think that we will see a bigger retrenchment of the globalization in some sector, and a bigger consumption of national brands. Of course, this was also a political issue before the pandemic, but now it will be used as a marketing tool. It's better if you, I don't know, if you buy Italian cookies, because the Italian cookies are always there, while if you buy, I don't know, US cookies, maybe they will not be there because we have a problem in the supply chain. And the last point is, but not the least important, on the contrary, is the point of political issues. We will see that the global value chain will be reshaped, in a sense, in more political value chains that are more connected to political issues. Of course, we had already seen a period like this. If we think about the Cold War, we had the GATT bloc, we had the Comecon bloc. I'm not telling that we will be back to this point, of course. We will not have two different part bloc, economic bloc, but I think that we will see a more politically oriented supply chain, because the state will intervene more, and they will try to influence how the global value chain, how the supply chain is shaped, trying to gaining more influence on this process. Here I present a very, very basic model that is only used to underline an issue. So I present how this model that is very basic works. We had an economy that is made by plots of land that can be used to cultivate crops A or crops B. The crops B that has a yield of capital B, so the capital A and B are the yields of the crop A and B. So we have this yield, this crop that is the crop B that has a higher yield, so it's better in terms of your harvest, but is prone to a virus, of course, given that we are in a pandemic, and this virus hits the crop for a number of years. So the cycle is made by N years, that is normal years, when you have your crop that is normally cultivated and harvested, and you have a period of D years where the virus destroys completely your harvest. So you must decide how much land you want to use for the A crop or the B crop. If you only allot your land to the A crop, you have less yield, but you are, in a sense, insured against the virus, because the virus only hits the B crop. If you allot your land to the B crop, you have a higher yield, but you are hit by the virus sometimes. So what is the tipping point condition? What is the condition that makes B better than A in terms of the profits of this firm? This is the tipping point condition. And of course, this tipping point condition tells us that the higher is the yield of B, the better is to use B, and the longer is the period of the virus, and the less convenient is to switch to B. This is very obvious, but the point for us is that you do not have intermediate maximum. Either you go fully towards B or you stay fully towards A. This is the idea, and we think that this is what more or less happens in the supply chains. You tend to fully, in a sense, outsource something because you think that is better in terms of profitability, or you stay home. What is the problem in this landscape? The problem is that there is a huge informational difference between the yield, that this is very easy to assess, and the virus, that is anyone's guess. For instance, if you ask to a responsible for the supply chain, I don't know, of Volkswagen or Samsung or another big company, and you ask how much you pay for having your parts in Germany, in Korea, in China, in Thailand, whatever, I think that he or she has a very clear idea of the cost. But of course, how can you calculate how much the global value chain will be disrupted by something that never happened? Because the COVID-19 pandemic is something that in this form never happened. So without having data about disruption, without having data about how much costs the global value chain to having a disruption, what you have is only the higher yield of your global value chain. In other terms, we have here a classical prisoner's dilemma framework, because for you as a single firm, it's better to use the global value chain because you increase your profitability. The issue, that is a possible disruption of the global value chain, is not a problem for you as a firm, it's a problem for the economy as a whole. So it's something that is not your responsibility. Is the government, it's a government problem, is an issue of the world economy, is not something that is connected to you. This is the point. Another important point is that if you see how global value chains have been affected by the pandemic, and also before, you see that normally the factors that reduce, so to speak, B, that is the factor that reduce the relative profitability of the two situations, offshoring versus staying at home, also tends to reduce the effects of a possible disruption of the global value chains. So making a calculation beforehand of if some of the different possibilities is very difficult. And I think that it's safe to assume that this calculation is very different in different sectors and goods. So it's difficult to conclude univocally what is the best outcome. It's likely that the outcome will be different, but what is common in all the sectors is what I have said about the prisoner's dilemma framework. That is, every firm can internalize the profitability gain of global value chain, and when something happened to the value chain, this is not something that is connected only to you. Because the point is that when a global value chain is disrupted, maybe that all all the sector will be hit, not only the firms that have a bigger part of their production abroad. So the paradoxical situation is that the systemic risk increase due to the global value chain is not necessarily a problem for the firms that are responsible for this increase. I make an analogy with the financial sector once again. When the 2008 crisis hit the world financial markets, of course, the first banks that were hit were the banks that were more interested in the subprime market, because of course this was the first one that was hit. But if you see after 3 or 4 or 5 years, many banks that were not present at all in the subprime markets were hit so much that were bankrupt. For instance, the Italian banks that were not present at all in the ABS market, in the subprime market, in general, in more innovative finance, were on the verge of the bankruptcy because of the general situation of the financial market. So the problem is that every firm is interested in increasing its participation in global value chain, in the global value chains, because the benefits are only for the firm and the problems are for everyone. That's the problem. This is why in our very simple model, we call Q the proportion of the land that is allowed to be. Out of the metaphor, Q is the proportion of the production that is offshore, that is based on a global value chain. There is a tendency for the firms to go towards Q equal 1, that is to go fully into global value chains, even if there are risks of a disruption, because the issues that I have talked about. For instance, I use these examples. When in Thailand there was a river floods that destroyed different plants that produced factories that produced part of the computer industry global value chain, hard disk drives. Many observers were expecting that the big firms that were producing hard disk drives in Thailand were moving this production in other countries. On the contrary, we have seen that not only this did not happen, but on the contrary, the same enterprises concentrated more production in Thailand because the higher yield to produce this product in Thailand for them was more important than the risk to having a new disruption, maybe in 5 years, or 10 years, or whatever. So this is only an example, of course, but it highlights the issue. The issue is that global value chains have a very different outcome in terms of risk and benefits. And so when we apprise why someone is choosing global value chain, the problem is that we have different level of discussion. We have a firm level, and we have, of course, a country or a general level. So what kind of industrial policies will come from all this situation? Of course, the trade policies, even before the pandemic, even before the global value chains, were full of distortions, of course, and it's very difficult to solve all this kind of distortions. And it's difficult to identify a policy that is not in some way distorted. For many years, governments acted very pragmatically, that is, without a general strategy on global value chains, maybe with the exception of China, but in general, the governments had no a general strategy, but they pursued single policies in single sectors with different results. It is important to point out that many years before Trump, many administrations, and also in the US, the Obama administration, were preparing strategies, programs to have a kind of reshoring of the production in the country. In the EU and in UK, we had similar plans, similar to the blueprint from an American Bill to Last of Obama. It is also important to point out that reshoring is used politically as it was different from creating a new job. For instance, why reshoring 1,000 jobs is different from creating 1,000 jobs? If the point is to have more jobs, I can reshore a plant with 500 workers, and I can create a new plant with 500 workers. What is the difference? The point, of course, is that politically, this is used as a marketing tool to say, we are rebuilding our glorious past, we are rebuilding our factory, we are rebuilding our nation, we are reclaiming our glorious industrial past, when in practice, if you analyze the real figures of reshoring in the last 10 years, the figures are absolutely ridiculous. Here I have put the data for the US. The figure is less than 800,000 in 10 years out of a labor force in excess of 163 million. So of course, these data maybe are not complete because someone can not telling that is reshoring because he must admit that he offshored in the first place. But in general, the reshoring trend is not very important if we look at the general labor market. The point is political. The point is that now the political issues, the security issues, the health issues can, and we think that will be used to favor reshoring, not necessarily for economic reasons, but for political reasons, to state that the country is trying to stop the globalization to hit the country and so on. And we have also discussed if our Q, that is how much we participate in the global value chains, can be in a sense capped by law. We have, of course, a lot of regulation that cap something. For instance, we have the capital requirements in the banking regulation, we have environment caps and so on and so forth. The point is that if you try to envisage concretely how a capped Q could work, it is very difficult to make it work. For instance, let's take the car industry as an example. Let's say that, I don't know, in the EU, you pass a law that cap Q to 80%. You cannot offshore more than 80% of your production. But for a car, what does it mean? Does it mean that it's the value of the car that you cannot offshore? So if a car costs, I don't know, 10,000 euro, this means that 8,000 euro can be made abroad, or you are talking about the single car. So if you produce 1 million car, 200,000 of this car must be made in your country. This is, of course, a very different conclusion. What about the different productions? For instance, I don't know, Volkswagen produce 50 kinds of car. Does Volkswagen is obliged to produce every single product, at least 20% of every single product in Germany? Of course, this would be very, very costly. So maybe this applies to the overall net sales of the firm. But of course, this is a completely different point, because you can still participate very much in the global value chains and retaining at home only, I don't know, the R&D department. So if you think about how the industrial products are made today, trying to fix, in a sense, a maximum participation in a global value chain is very difficult. So this is why I think it's difficult to find proposals about it, about a reduction in the participation in the global value chain, exactly because it's very difficult to create really a tool that can really work in the present situation. What are the conclusions of our works? The conclusion is that to go back from globalization is a lot more said than done. For instance, the Pentagon have been tried to reduce the US over-reliance on China for critical supplies, at least since the half of 2010. Why? Well, because of course, if as the US considers China to be a competitor, not a military competitor, but an economic competitor, it's a bit strange that most of the weapons in the US are made with parts coming from China. Because of course, if China blocks this export, basically the US cannot go on with its military. So this is a problem. But the problem is that the Pentagon, after reviewing this situation, was not able to find an alternative solution. So the Pentagon tried, but did not succeed. And of course, if the Pentagon, there is a very big, how to say, a big possibility to intervene in the US economy, how can another sector be in a better position? We have seen in the EU, by EU commentators and also by EU top politicians, positions not against globalization or global value chains, but against too much of it. From the start of the pandemic, you can see that there are a lot of these talk about too far globalization, too much globalization. So the globalization, we are going a bit too far. So we must retrench from too much globalization. But once again, apart from these articles, apart from the cheap talk on the newspapers, if you try to think how this can happen in the real supply chains, this is very, very difficult. Another point, important point, is that the history has taught us that paradoxically trade wars reduce manufacturing jobs in both the competitor of the war. And this is happening right now in China and in the US in their conflict. So the paradox is the trade wars in the situation, and so pushes for more rounds of the war, because the logic is a vicious circle. They are trying to hit us, so we will hit them back with more retaliation, and so on and so forth. What we can say is that inevitably the states will participate in these trade wars, and they will try to push the firms to reorganize in, as I said, a more politically value chain, so to speak. Of course, this will be different in the different parts of the world, because, for instance, China is a very big country and economy. On the contrary, the EU is not even a country and is not likely that it will become one any soon. So the different EU countries will have different ideas, different projects, different strategies, and of course, this is a big problem. The US, of course, has a natural, so to speak, regional value chains from Alaska to Latin America, but this does not mean that the value chain is necessarily connected to a geographic aspect. But anyway, the states will be forced to participate in this reshaping. And I think that the Western countries will see that China has a huge advantage, because the state in China is a lot more present and is a lot more stronger vis-a-vis the private capital, the private entrepreneur. And so, in a sense, the Western countries will be forced, so to speak, to imitate China, to fight with China. We will see for sure regional agreements more than before. They were there, of course, even before 2020, before the pandemic, but we will see a growth, I think, of these regional agreements, and one has been signed by China and other Asian countries just some months ago. And these regional agreements, of course, will not be only an economic issue, they will be also a political realignment. For instance, if we see the situation of Pakistan or Philippines, there were two classical, long-standing allies of the US, and in a sense, they are distancing from the US. They are more and more influenced by China, because of course the trades with China are growing and the trades with America are going down. So the importance of China for the other Asian countries is
I think, okay, yeah.
You must have every people in the world vaccinated in order to have everyone vaccinated. But the point is that this cooperation that is more vital than ever is hit by the pandemic itself. For instance, at the beginning of the pandemic, we have seen a very uncooperative behavior, even, for instance, among the EU members, and even, that is even more strange, among US states. We had different US states, California, Nevada, New Jersey, competing each other for masks and other medical products. So you have a situation where cooperation is more needed than ever, and when cooperation is not there because of the economic situation. Our last point is that all this trend of reshoring that is not for us economically important, has not been economically important so far, will become important, not on the economic side, not because it is reshaping global value chain a lot, apart from some sector. The problem is that the idea of reshoring will be important politically, will be important because it will be used as a strategy, as a political strategy to convince people that the government are doing something for them. So just like, in a sense, globalization in the 90s was used as a marketing device to say everything will be fine because we are globalizing the world, now reshoring is used a bit in the same way. Even if, as I said, in reality, the results of the globalization, the results of the global value chains are not automatic. They depend from your policies, from how you participate in the globalization, how you reshape your labor market, your fiscal policies, and so on. So the danger is that reshoring will be simply used as a tool against other countries, as a way to distract the people from more important issues. Even if at the end of the day, also the pandemic has shown that going back from the global value chain is very difficult. And so it's difficult to envisage a situation where the world has completely go beyond world supply chains, because the situation is very entrenched. The value chain are so important that it's impossible to think of reversing them. The point is that reshoring will be used, the idea of deglobalize a country will be used, as I said, from a political point of view. Okay, I finished my presentation.
Thank you, Lorenzo. That was super interesting, and I'm sure there will be many questions attached to this. I have a couple, but I want to give precedence to our early career researchers who are here. So we have a few people booked for questions. So Akis first, and then Mariana, and then I invite other people to sign up by just writing their names in the chat. So Akis, over to you.
Thank you, Professor, for this very interesting presentation. Speaking of vicious circles, the 2008 financial crisis spun the south of Europe into some endless vicious circles of poverty. Given that the primary idea behind the global sourcing is that we manufacture in countries where the labor is cheap in order to maximize our profits, should we expect another financial crisis in Europe that will further reduce the income of the people in order to justify this reshoring strategy? Thank you.
Well, I think that for the situation now, it's difficult to go back politically to the ideas of austerity, internal devaluation, and so on, because we are in a different context. This doesn't mean that they will try something about it, but I think that now the situation is a bit different. So I think that on this front, the situation is different from, I don't know, when the Syriza, the government of Varoufakis and Syriza in general was attacked by the ECB, by the Troika, etc. Because the situation is different now. So the point now, the point will be a bit different. Of course, there is an issue of wages and productivity, because the point is that the productivity is slowing down everywhere, and especially in the southern Mediterranean countries, Italy in particular, the growth of productivity in the last 10 or 20 years has been very, very low. So you have this problem, but of course you cannot cure it simply cutting wages and the welfare state. So you must put in place other policies. And I think that on this front, the situation is a bit better than before, because the general understanding, even on the establishment newspaper, is that you cannot use all the receipts. And in fact, if you take the you can find the article receipt, but this is a very, very small part of the discussion. The bulk of the discussion is about public investment, public funds, public intervention. So the situation, I think, it's different.
Thank you, Pro. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lorenzo. Mariana, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon. My question I wrote here is, will we survive? Economically speaking, I pictured like before the pandemic, an economy a bit maybe sick, if I can call it, with huge investments, governmental investments, which makes me think about recession and inflation. And after the pandemic, after or during the pandemic, we are living the raise of the unemployment. And I'm thinking about us, people, society. How will we survive in this sense, in this global supply chains to sell to whom, to which market? Maybe I'm just thinking loudly. Thank you.
Well, the important point is that, generally speaking, the survival of the people, literally, that is not becoming statistics of the deaths by the COVID-19, and economically, is now linked to what the states, central banks, and governments are doing. So the discussion now is about this. This is the situation, and this is very different from, I don't know, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, where the governments and the central banks had the only role to not interfere with the market, with the economy that was going fine. So this is a very important point, because if you remain in the old landscape, in the old framework, so to speak, you are going to underline the importance of the states, to attack the laissez-faire regimes when the situation is different. Now the point is not laissez-faire, that is not interesting for everyone. The point is how public funds will be used, because public funds can still be used to implement wrong policies. Public does not mean right automatically, of course. So the point is not if the state must intervene to survival, because this is no more interesting, because it's obvious. The point is how you intervene. For instance, if you look at the discussion the last year, from, I would say, March to May, the discussion on how the EU should have intervened in the pandemic, you can see that 99% of the discussion was about how to fund the intervention. That was completely useless, because the point was not money, the point was practical intervention. How you can get the masks, how you can get the vaccines, how you can distance people, how you can rebuild public transportation, how can you rebuild your health system. The point was not funding, that of course is there as a problem, but is a very, very secondary issue. The point is rebuilding, reshaping how the economy works, how public services work. And why the discussion was completely distorted in this way? Because this was the old 2008 discussion. When in 2008 the banks failed, of course the point was money, because if you put money in a bank, this does not fail anymore. It's just simply like this. You give a bank a lot of money, and the bank is doing fine. But this is not how other sectors works. You can give a lot of money to a doctor, but this does not mean that the doctor produces you a vaccine, because this is a very, very complex industrial process. So you must have in place researchers, factories, universities, and so on and so forth. So the point to me is that you now have the right, so to speak, mind in terms of the importance of public intervention, but we are still discussing a useless problem, that is how to fund what we must do, and we are not discussing what to do, and that's the problem. So it's now clear that the public intervention is needed for our survival, but to me it's not very clear what we should discuss on this intervention. This is not still the point.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Very insightful.
Thank you.
And we have got Giuseppe next. Giuseppe.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. How do you see how consistent has been the approach of the European Union as a bloc, and how big were the differences between the member states? And if you think that the consistency of the lack of inconsistency between European Commission and member states, is it a problem, or is there any effective joint action or joint strategy?
Well, I will divide the answer into. The first point is the institutions of EU. At the EU level, we have two different institutions. We have intergovernmental institutions and we have European institutions. The only real European institution is the ECB. And the ECB is the only institution that works because the ECB can decide to intervene in a matter of minutes. And the ECB can intervene independently from anyone else. This is what Draghi did in 2012. This is what the Lagarde did at the start of the pandemic. On the contrary, the intergovernmental institutions are a problem because in order to have them moving, you have to discuss with hundreds of different people that have very different problems because maybe you have the election, I don't know, in Germany, so the German representative cannot say anything. Then you have the election in France, so the French people cannot say anything. Then you have, I don't know, the administrative election in Netherlands, so the Netherlands people must be very tough for political reasons, and so on and so forth. So the intergovernmental part of the EU is dysfunctional. And the pandemic has shown that it's dysfunctional as can be. In fact, you can see that after 2 or 3 months from the start of the vaccination campaign, EU is lagging behind the UK and the US. That is ridiculous because the US health system is ridiculous vis-a-vis the EU health system. In the US, it doesn't exist a real national health system. And yet they are about a third of the people vaccinated. And in Europe, we have maybe a 10, 15%. So this is a clear demonstration of the fact that on the intergovernmental level, the EU is not working and is not going to work better tomorrow. As far as the global value chains are concerned, the point is that a common strategy does not exist because the role of the different countries is completely different. For instance, if you take, I don't know, Hungary or Poland, they are part of the Germany global value chains. They are like a land of Germany in terms of global value chains because they produce for Germany. If you take, I don't know, Italy, the north of Italy is, I would say, a third or maybe 40% of the northern Italy, that is the most industrialized part of Italy, work for the German counterparts. They are basically supplier of Germany big firms. So the point is that the EU never produced a common strategy because the countries have a very different role in the supply chains. And this is the problem. This is also how the issue of pandemic was taken at the beginning. At the beginning, when the pandemic arrived in Europe, it arrived in Italy, as we know. And the reason why other countries were not keen to block the economy was because they waited Italy to block the economy so they can gain market shares. This was the reality. They were waiting that the other will block the economy so they can advantage from the lockdown of other member states. And of course, if you have this kind of strategy, this means that the Europe as a common center of decision does not exist. This is the problem. And even now, even if you have this kind of discussion about the recovery fund, etc., all the discussion, as I said, is about funding. We can fund our battle against the pandemic altogether. Good, but this is not the point. The point is, can you build an European economy that is able to tackle the pandemic of, I don't know, COVID-24, if it's come out. This is the point. Are you creating the supply chain, the coordination in terms of the health system, the coordination in terms of how the borders are closed or open, etc., so that you can intervene in a global pandemic tomorrow? This is the point. And I think that on this issue, we have not had a single step forward since the start of the pandemic.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Very interesting. Yeah, regarding this lack of coordination in the industrial policy of European countries, we were reading last week about an attempt from European countries, from the EU, to try to reshore a bit of the semiconductors chips back to the EU. And basically, you know, we were reading a report from a consultancy firm which said, well, this will take at least 10 or 15 years. So I think, you know, this tells a lot about the slow response that the EU can put in place, even to act against urgent problems, because there is at the moment a global shortage of semiconductor chips. And as you were saying, we have seen this quite a lot at the start of the response to the pandemic, where we weren't even able to manufacture simple objects like masks within the EU. We have other questions. I think Renato wanted to ask one. Over to you, Renato.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. First of all, let me say thank you to Lorenzo for his very nice and challenging presentation. And my question is about the tax system. I have seen that in your presentation, Lorenzo, the tax system, let's say the tax leverage, that is one of the main aspects of the international scenario, particularly for what about the multinationals, is not the tax system is not considered. In one of your slides, you illustrated the motivation to the global value chain, and tax leverage was not among this. So my question is also because the OECD is trying to combat the international tax avoidance. And so this is an important topic on the political agenda in the post-pandemic scenario. So my question is, in a few words, why you do not consider this kind of this kind of leverage? And in your model, in your interpretive approach of the post-pandemic scenario, how tax leverage can be, how tax can be leveraged to reduce the gaps among countries, or to reduce the divide among groups of countries like global southern countries and global northern countries. So, thank you for your answer.
Thank you. Well, in our presentation, the tax are part of the public intervention. So, for instance, when you have a country that is eager to innovation in global value chains, you have, of course, pull strategies like reducing taxes, giving incentives, and so on. So, of course, the tax are part of the scheme. The point is that these kind of policies that were typical in the 90s and in the first years of 2000, so tax incentives to take or to onboard multinationals, we can see these in Ireland, etc. Then in the last years, we have another kind of use of taxation, that is classical tax to to attack the importation from other countries. So these policies of reducing importation using taxes. I don't think that these kind of taxes are very important because, of course, in a global value chain, it's very difficult to understand how a tax will really hit someone. On the contrary, the first part of this tax avoidance, tax havens, etc., of fiscal havens, etc., is a very huge problem because in these havens that are also inside Europe, but of course most are outside the EU, there are a lot of money, and these are monies that are useless because, of course, they are not used for investment; they are only used for emergency, so to speak, of multinationals. And we have seen a paradoxical situation, for instance, with the Apple and other big firms that had hundreds and hundreds of the billions parked in abroad, so not used for investment, but simply used as a, for instance, to pay back to dividends to shareholders, etc. So for sure, this is a big problem. And once again, I go back to the problem of the EU. You have a situation where in the EU, these kind of incentives, if we can call them in this way, are used to attract firms from other countries. We have seen this in Luxembourg, in Ireland, in Netherlands, etc. We will see this once again tomorrow in Britain after the Brexit, etc. And of course, this is not acceptable because this is not something that increase, I don't know, the scale economy. It's not something that increase the welfare of someone. This is only something that it's an advantage for you as a country that give a tax break to someone at expenses of another country. So this is absolutely intolerable. Moreover, if you study this kind of tax havens, you can see that it's very difficult to divide the so-called good capital from the bad one. It's very difficult to divide what is the profits, I don't know, of Apple that is parked there, and what are profits of the mafia, or profits of other less commendable organization than the multinational. It's very difficult. It's very difficult because they are, how can we say, they are very, very mixed. You cannot distinguish a dollar made out of drugs and a dollar made out of selling a smartphone. For instance, 2 or 3 months ago, there were different articles of the British press that underlined the fact that for the UK regulators, a third of money in the city comes from the mafia. A third of the all investment of the city, that is the biggest financial hub on a world scale, came from originally, of course, not now, but originally came from recycling of money laundering. So this problem of tax haven is very strong, not only in terms of tax avoidance, social inequality, impossibility to fund public investment and so on, but it's a problem also because in this financial hub and this financial haven, you have the connection, you have the mix of legal and illegal economy. So this is a very, very big problem because we are talking about trillions of dollars. It's not an issue of money laundering, I don't know, thousands or millions. We are talking about trillions. So this is a very, very big point. Of course, you must act internationally. The problem is that it's very difficult because of course here you have a classical prisoner's dilemma logic. For instance, you know that in the US, even in the US, there are issues among the different states. For instance, most of US firms are incorporated in Delaware. Why? Delaware is a very small country with no importance whatsoever. They are incorporated in Delaware because the law of Delaware are very, very good to the firms. And of course, if even in the US, you have this kind of competition among the states, you can imagine how more like this is in the EU or on international scale. So I think that this is the right moment for discussing a situation where tax avoidance is no more possible. You must pay the taxes that you must pay. You cannot move. Of course, it's different if you close your factories in I don't know, in Spain. You go in Germany, and that's a different point. But if you stay just the same as you were yesterday, but you only change your name to avoid taxes, of course, this is not acceptable.
Okay, thank you, Lorenzo, for the very comprehensive answer. I think Tommaso wanted to ask something. Tommaso, you here?
Yes. Hi, Lorenzo. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Really interesting. My question is related to your model and to the trade, let's say, that you showed that there could be between a product produced by a local supply chain and one by a global supply chain. And the question is related to how these yields are calculated. Like, are they calculated using input-output tables, or also other methods can be used?
Well, we did not conduct still yet empirical analysis, but the point is that you can use, of course, input-output analysis, the word input-output tables that are not. The problem is of this statistic is that these statistics are not very updated because they are 3 or 4 years old, and in this situation things change so rapidly that data from 4 years ago is useless to understand the point. This is the first problem. The second problem is that these statistics are not always able to capture how the global value chain is really created, because of course the statistics are on a national level and the global value chain are on a firm level. So if you have a factory of Volkswagen in Hungary, from a statistical point of view, when this factory takes the products to Germany, this is an export to Germany, but of course for the Volkswagen is not an export. It's a factory that is producing something from another factory. So you have all these kind of problems. But anyway, our point is that it's not so difficult to make this kind of calculation. And I think that if you go to a firm level, not on a statistical level, but if you go to a firm level, if you speak with the responsible of the logistic chain for a big multinational company, these people can tell you how much does it cost to make a spare part in China, in Germany, in Brazil, or in Australia. This calculation is made by the firm, of course. So we think that this part of the measurement is easy. Maybe it's not easy for us as economists because we can only use the statistics of the input-output analysis on international made by, I don't know, the World Bank, the IMF, etc. But for the firms, this calculation is relatively easy. So our point is that on the point of view of the information statistic issue, the different yield is relatively easy to be calculated. On the contrary, the disruption calculation is very difficult to make.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I don't know if there is any further question from the audience. If not, I have a very final one, Lorenzo, regarding the near future. So, do you foresee China becoming the champion of globalization? I think to some extent we are already in this situation, because if you listen to the speeches that President Xi is giving to the World Economic Forums, I think in the last 2-3 years, he has become the champion of globalization. Do you think this role that China is playing, you know, as a sort of engine of the global value chains will even increase in the future when China will also try to import more goods to reduce its trade surplus in order also to boost the internal consumption of its growing middle class? What kind of scenario do you see? And where do you see Europe going? I mean, also with the election of Joe Biden in the US, also given, you know, the huge links that the German economy, for instance, has with the Chinese value chains, both in terms of export and in terms of import.
This is a very important point. For sure, if we look at the Davos forum, it's a bit strange that the only one that was in favor of the free trade was the head of the biggest communist party in the world. But this is how things are going in these days. So the point is that, of course, China wants to have a situation where it can go abroad easily with its products. But for sure, not only China now has a very big internal market, and in some sector, in a sense, it's even beyond the West. For instance, in the digital payment, China is a lot beyond the US and the EU. But if we look at the RCEP, the regional agreement with the other countries, I think that this shows that China now is also reasoning in this situation. The US, of course, is still the biggest market, and it will be for a lot of time. But if we take together Japan, Korea, India, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, etc., we have, I don't know, maybe 2 billion people, 2 billion and a half people that, of course, are not rich as the US people, but they can have still a very important market importance. So I think that China will increase these regional agreements, not only on the global value chain part, but also on the market side. They are easy to be connected to China with the Belt Road Initiative, etc. And so with the direct neighbor, China is increasing its links, and now I think that, I don't know, Korea or Vietnam or other countries around China are basically dependent from China, as I don't know, Poland is dependent from Germany, of course. In other parts of the world, for instance, Central Asia, Africa, etc., the point is logistics. So the point is to creating the situation to have a better situations, an easier situations in terms of supply for China. And this is also why, if we look, for instance, at the modernization of the army in China, the focus point is the navy, because of course the navy must protect the sea roads for China. On the contrary, I don't know, aviation has no role because China is not predicting to invade another country with the air carrier. So this is not the point. But the navy, of course, are important. So China is creating a situation where it connects to other parts of the world in different ways. In Europe, it sells products, and sometimes it also buys firms because it is convenient. In other parts of the world, it creates infrastructures to have a logistic more favorable situation. And in the US, basically, it sells products. So this is a strategy. But the point is that the big difference between China and even the US, that are a unified country, is that the China establishment, the China leadership thinks in terms of decades. The Western leadership thinks in terms of months. For instance, if you If you look at the reports of the military report of the US, or also the EU economic reports, the time span that are considered in this report is maybe 3 years, 5 years. Why? Because the people that are writing this report will be there for 3, 4 years, and that's it. After 4 or 5 years, you will have another job in another country or whatever. You will be in a different context. So you are not interested on what's going on in your firm in 5 years, in your country in 5 years. You are not projecting the situation in the future, in a distant future. On the contrary, China has done exactly this for 40 years. So the strong position that they have is connected to this. They have maybe they have a weaker position in some sector, but they build this sector for the next 20 years in order to overcome the gap with other countries. This is not how West reasons anymore. When I go back to the 2008 financial crisis, there have been a huge discussion about what is called the short-termism. The fact that the CEOs of banks only have in mind the next quarter results, because they must, with these results, they take their stock option and that's it. Of course, when your time span is the next quarter, you cannot build a strategy for the future, because the next quarter is not exactly the future. This next quarter is just around the corner. On the contrary, you must have in place a strategy for 20 years. The problem is that it's very difficult structurally, because I don't know if the prime minister of a Western country goes in television and says, look, citizens, we must do very difficult things for 10 years and then we will be fine. The next day is out of office, of course. This is not how it works. He cannot, or she cannot say something like this. He must pretend always to have a solution for tomorrow. This is how politics works in the West. Even if you take Trump, and of course it was a very peculiar politician, but the fulcrum of the Trump strategy was, I have a solution that tomorrow will work. I build the wall so immigrants cannot come anymore. I put taxes on China so China cannot export here anymore, etc. And of course, this is not how things work, because if we go back to global value chains have been built in decades, and they must reshape for next decades, not for the next months. And so this is the problem. The West has very difficult. It's very difficult for the Western leadership nowadays. The entrepreneurs, the CEOs of big firms, politicians, etc., top officers of the public administrations, to think about 10 years, 15 years, the next generation. And this is why, when we go back to the policies that are implemented, we can see that they are many times they are inconsistent or very weak or very, very partial, because they do not have a vision of the future. But not because they are stupid, but because the structure, the political general structure is made in this way. So it's very difficult for them to create a politics that works in the next decades. It only have to work for the next election. I hope I replied to the question more or less.
Excellent. Thank you, Lorenzo, for your very, very insightful answer. Yeah, I think we don't have any other questions, so we can free you. And thank you very much for being with us today, and for agreeing also to take question for much longer than we expected. I think, it has been a very interesting debate. So thank you very much for your presentation, for your insightful points, and thank you to everybody for the excellent questions and contributions to the debate. And of course, we will also send you, Lorenzo, the recording of this event so that you'll be able to share it on social media. So thank you very much. It has been really a pleasure having you with us today, and we will stay in touch. And talk to you soon, and
thank you very much.
Stay safe. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.